Good evening. My name is Peter van Dommelen. I'm the Joukowski Family Professor of Archaeology here in this institute, one of the three in this institute. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you tonight here Professor Yannis Hamilakis. And it's a great pleasure to introduce to you particular Yannis, a distinguished scholar, but also an engaged citizen, as well as a person with whom it is good to hang out with. So let me qualify those three things, those three elements to introduce him, to characterize him a little bit in more detail to you, to get an impression of the many dimensions and interests and strengths indeed of his. First, distinctions. That's where I need to check here. He's because there's many of them. He's been a member of the Princeton Institute of Advanced Studies. He's been a Getty Scholar, but also a fellow of the Onassis Foundation. He has been a regular keynote speaker at conferences, and at quite diverse conferences, like the annual Greek Studies Conference, or the one that's still coming up, I think. Yes, exactly. But also a symposium on Minoan archaeology, as well as the Carbondale conferences. Yannis also sits on no less than 14 advisory boards of journals and book series, and that include Annual Review Anthropology, Journal of Mediterranean Archaeology, but also Current Swedish Archaeology. And I think that's one you didn't see coming. I barely need to mention his two books, The Nation in Its Ruins from 2007 and Archaeology of the Census from 2013. The second point, though, engagement, and especially social and political engagement. Yannis was one of the co-founders of the Radical Archaeology Forum in the 1990s. So that was particularly in Britain. And he's also a frequent contributor to the media in his adopted country, in the UK, but also and especially in his home country, Greece. And in Greece, in fact, much of his work has been translated and has entered sort of general discussions about the past and archaeology as well. His book, The Nation in Its Ruins, plays, in fact, a big part in some of those discussions. And in recent years, moreover, he has been actively introducing and engaging local communities in his work by involving them in the field work on the islands of Poros and recent field work in central Greece. Finally then, great person. I've personally found it always a pleasure to come across him at various conferences over many years and to have many sort of engage in many discussions about lots of different things. And I would also guess that his many invitations for lectures and keynotes and so recognized implicitly at least that point as well. Who would not want to invite a person who's always willing to talk and discuss about lots of interesting things? And many of you will have an opportunity for that after this lecture. But to wrap up this introduction, just to add to you for your information, Yannis acquired these many strengths and harnessed all those interests during an MSc and a PhD at the University of Sheffield, and subsequently during lectureships. He first was a lecturer at the University of Lampeter in Wales, and that may not be a place that means too much to many of you, but certainly in the 1990s, Lampeter was the place to be in British academia. And he was there in the interesting years. From 2000, he's been at the University of Southampton, where he was promoted to full professor in 2010. So you will therefore appreciate, and just the full room demonstrates that very fact, what a pleasure and honor it is to host Yannis here at the Institute for a couple of days and to present to you his lecture, Material Memories and the Escape from the Prison of the Present, a multitemporal archaeology. Yannis.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this introduction, and thank you for the invitation to all, to the Institute and to the community of the Institute and to Brown. It's always been a pleasure to be here. I've been now, I think this is the 5th time, so it feels like a homecoming in some ways. So I'm really looking forward to your interaction and with what I'm going to say and your feedback to some of the ideas that I'm going to be exploring today. Now, some of these ideas are things I've already expressed in some other publications, especially recently, especially the book that Peter mentioned, The Archaeology of the Census. But some of them are, in fact, work in progress that I am developing, especially in relation to notions of temporality. So, I would like to start by invoking through photography two random stones not far from each other. I encountered the first one, which I'm showing here, and some of you may be familiar because I have shown it before in presentations. I encountered the first one in 2005 on the Acropolis of Athens. I was astonished that despite being there for guided tours and other events many times, having experienced as a student the classical archaeology curriculum in Greece, and despite having seen many tourist booklets and other publications on the site, I had never encountered this architectural fragment before. In fact, I realized afterwards that the only published academic account of it is an obscure 1927 classical archaeology report on the Erechtheion, the monument that this fragment was originally part of. It was clear to me that this piece was not meant to be there. It was not part of the tourist itinerary, it was not signposted, and in fact, it was half buried in rubble when I first encountered it. This object has survived the nearly 200-year-old archaeological purification of the site from what has been called all remnants of barbarity. Now, being a matter out of place has its benefits. Unlike with the other monuments, unlike with the officially designated as proper archaeological material objects worthy of tourist attention, which were kept at a safe distance from the visitor and behind ropes, I was able to come close to this and even trace with my own hands the carved letters on its surface. I could do that without risking being told off by the guard, without violating the almost universal imperative of iconic heritage and museum sites the world over. Do not touch. So, here we have a marble piece which, if we were to do the standard archaeological thing, we'd call it a classical 5th century BC architectural fragment from the Temple of Erechtheion with some later interference. Or, if we wanted to be more charitable, we'd talk of the post-classical reuse of a classical piece coming from one of the most famous temples of antiquity. In front of us, as many of you I'm sure have already recognized, we have an inscription in Arabic script which was carved in 1805 when the Acropolis of Athens was under Ottoman rule and was used as a fortress. The block was then embedded in one of the vaulted entrances into the Acropolis. The inscription, by the way, praises the Ottoman governor of Athens and his achievement in fortifying the Acropolis. Yet, once someone has been gripped by this piece and its agency, we will start to notice that this, in fact, is not the only trace of Ottoman presence on the site of the Acropolis. A few meters away from it, and again not part of the visitor's itinerary, in this pile of stones which were almost hidden, as much away from the tourist gaze as possible, one can observe the remnants of headstones from Muslim burials. One can immediately recall the iconographic memories of the Muslim cemetery that existed in the south slope of the Acropolis until the 19th century, early 19th century, and which has been illustrated in traveler's drawings such as the one by Thomas Hope here. But I want to show you the second stone, the second piece, which in this case is a soft limestone block. Now, this one comes from one of my ethnographic sites, the sanctuary of Poseidon on the island of Poros in the Saronic Gulf. Its ancient name was Calabria. When in 2007, I started my ethnographic work on the island, having this site as the epicenter. This was one of the first material traces that caught my attention. But unlike with the previous stone from the Acropolis, with this one I had more than the stone itself to engage with. I quote, me. There are some initials here. It was us, we who wrote our names. Us, Vasilis, my brother Yannis. We have written our names with a hammer, yes. I asked him what the graffiti on the on the left corner is. How can I remember, my child? These must have been written, how old am I? 73? Well, 60 years back? 50? Do you understand? How come you wrote your initials here? Look, every child, every youngster, his mind is galloping. We've written some names here as well, and he points to some other architectural block. I remember this is a trove, ancient, exactly as you see it. This is the way we found it. We first wrote with a pencil and then sat down and carved them. Do you understand? All these, as you can see them now, we found them exactly like that. Now, you can tell that our interlocutor here is hesitant, almost embarrassed. He was talking to archaeologists, after all, and this was meant to be an ancient piece, not the ambivalence and the contradiction in the passage. Yes, we carved them, we carved these letters, and do you understand, we found them exactly like that. Now, this person, the person who was talking, my interlocutor, was until the 1970s the owner of the land which we now call the archaeological site of Calabria. A land which is now defined and demarcated, some would say protected, by a wire fence. This was the person who planted olive trees and almond trees and fig trees here, who grew up amongst the ruins of the sanctuary of Poseidon and grew wheat and barley for his family and animals, and who was forced out through compulsory expropriation and dragged to the courts once the state decided to reclaim that locale as a classical archaeological site. In more recent years, he would request to at least harvest the olive trees he planted, paying compensation to the state. Some years he was allowed to, some other years he was not, depending on the relationship he had with the guard of the site. I should be Poseidon, he said to me once. They, meaning the archaeologists, know nothing about this place. But back to the stone. Again, the standard archaeological narrative would claim that the stone is an ancient, probably 4th century in this case, 4th century BC, limestone block, part of the wall of one of the public buildings that used to surround the temple in ancient times. Now, just to give you a visual impression, the stone comes from this around here, and the temple of Poseidon is up here. The block has been in place since antiquity, but at the end of the 19th century, the large extended family I already mentioned settled amidst the ruins, building a farmstead and making the site their home until they were evicted by the Archaeological Service in the 1970s. And these are some of the early modern material traces we actually encounter on site during our ethnographic work. Remnants of that presence of the farmstead amongst the so-called classical archaeological ruins. As you have heard, it was the children of the family who would play amidst the stones and who would inscribe on the rough surface of this block their initials, as they did with other stones on the site, often noting their age and the date, graffiti which are now clearly visible to visitors, and note, for example, in this case, I have to go here to show you, okay, the initial here, Bitahamame, which stands for the name and the surname, and of course the date here, 1950-something, and of course here the age, eton, years 14, the age of the child at the time when will describe this. And here I come, with all these two examples, these two stones, to my central question for today. What time are these objects? How can we date these two pieces using our conventions of chronological successive time? Is this the fragment from the Acropolis ancient or early 19th century? Is the fragment from Calabria of a classical date or of the 20th century? Now, as we know in modernist archaeology, we are trapped within the conventions and the conventional perception of time as linear, as successive, as irreversible, and we rely on a chronometric, mostly chronometric understanding of it. Our increasingly very sophisticated scientific dating techniques are equally inscribed within that chronometric framework. Their aim is to achieve an as narrow as possible chronological range, ideally a moment in time, which can be attached to a specific object, artifact, building, or archaeological context. More often than not, is the earliest possible human interaction with a given material, which is chosen as the date of that material, that object. Artifact. In other words, modernist archaeology freezes time, arresting the biography of objects and artifacts to serve, of course, the analytical purposes of our framework, of our modernist framework. And yet, a few critics in recent years have voiced their dissatisfaction with this chronometric understanding and have explored different perceptions of time, using concepts such as time perspectivism or palimpsests. I have, for example, here in mind some of the work that Jeff Bailey did for a number of years. But these attempts have relatively little impact, or they are marginalized as yet another theoretical reflection, or even a subfield, the archaeology of time, neatly placed in its own niche. Whereas mainstream archaeology, most of us, continue using the normative, chronometric thinking and doing business as usual. I contend that this, in fact, is the moment not only to reignite the discussion on archaeology and temporality, but more broadly, to propose a new temporal understanding, not only for archaeology, but also for our main research foci, that is materials and materiality. What makes this a particularly apt moment? Well, first, we have, for the first time in many decades, an extensive discussion in archaeology, which is not purely epistemological, but primarily ontological, in tandem with what has been called the ontological turn in other fields, such as in anthropology. We've thus opened the discussion not only on how to do archaeology, but on what archaeology is. What kind of relationships it engenders and establishes with matter, with time, and with experience. Then we have the establishment of subfields such as contemporary archaeology, which challenges conventional understanding of archaeology as the study of ancient things. Further, work on critical heritage has exposed the living and active presence of artifacts from diverse times in the present. Finally, in anthropology in general, we are also seeing the resurfacing of the discussion on the anthropology of time and on modes of historical understanding and historicization, on diverse ways of conceiving of and dealing with temporal experience. And I have here in mind the work by Charles Stewart and others. In conversation with earlier writings by Salins, by Gell, and by Nancy Mann. While these recent developments have been influential in my own thinking and in my own conception of a multitemporal archaeology, you will see in a minute that I diverge from them in some important ways. Furthermore, my own understanding of temporality cannot be separated from sensoriality, that is, from the entanglement of matter with senses, with bodily senses, with memory and with affect, themes which are outlined in the book we mentioned already, the archaeology and the senses. So, what kind of temporal understanding do these two pieces engender? In this case, it is the thought of philosophers such as Bergson, and also the Deleuzian take on Bergson, which I can have found more inspiring, and I can locate some important insights in our attempts to understand the implications of these things and the associated practices for temporality. Bergson problematized the relationship between matter, memory, and time, a problematization that allows us to think beyond the linearity and the modernist conception of time as a cumulative process. As we know, in modernity, and already mentioned, we encounter time not only as linear and successive, but also as cumulative and irreversible. This is the chronological and chronometric time, a mentality which is reminiscent of the modernist idea of progress as a linear process of advancing forward. Bergson instead developed a notion of experiential and mnemonic time, based on the links between matter and temporality, and on his thesis that every perception of the present moment is replete with memories. He recognized that the fundamental property of matter is its duration, its ability to last. As such, it embodies various times at once: the time of the original creation and production, as well as all other moments and instances, such as the time of the subsequent modification and redeployment, and the times of the reanimation and reactivation by sensorial and experiential processes. Past and present, thus, are not successive moments in a line, but rather coexist side by side. In the same way that every sensorial perception is at the same time past and present, since every perception is full of memories. So, past and present are both, quoting here Elizabeth Gross, modalities or dimensions of duration. And as Deleuze notes on this, the past and the present do not present two successive moments, but two elements which coexist. One is the present, which does not cease to pass, and the other is the past, which does not cease to be, but through which all presents pass. In other words, each present goes back to itself as past. Note here the difference between moments, instances, and elements. Or to continue with another Deleuzogram, past, present, and future are not dots in the line of time, but rather interpenetrating and commingled planes. In that sense, every given presence carries with it all pasts, but of course, through the selective process of memory, only specific pasts are conjured up at any specific moment. Now, Bergson and Deleuze have illustrated this relationship with the well-known graph, their famous cone, where the apex of the cone represents the present and condenses all past. The present condenses all past, being at the same time the memory of the present, which coexists with all pasts. Bergson, however, makes a crucial distinction between virtual and actual coexistence. All pasts coexist with the present, but only certain pasts are actualized at specific occasions. This is done through the selective process of recollection, mnemonic recollection, an inherited selective operation, which actualizes distinctive pasts which become present, taking a new form and a new life. This actualization happens because of the durational properties of matter and because of the selective character of mnemonic recollection. But this mnemonic selection is possible only because of sensorial attention and sensorial affectivity. It is because of the multisensorial entanglement with matter and because of the affective input of such entanglement that we are able to recollect and actualize certain pasts. Our two architectural blocks embody such a conception of time in an immediate and indirect way. As I mentioned already, we archaeologists, through our dating techniques, fix things in a certain moment in the past, often prioritizing their initial production and genesis at the expense of all other moments in their life. In this case, these two fragments are dated conventionally to the classical era broadly defined. The insistence on this temporal attribution, however, is not unrelated to their position within national imagination, as well as within Western imagery as a whole, which have declared classical antiquity as one of the golden ages and the foundational moment in the charter myth of Western modernity. Archaeology, as mnemonic recollection, has chosen to selectively remember the instant of the classical. The reshaping of these fragments of geology into architectural blocks, used in temples and sacred buildings during classical antiquity. As such, the subsequent moments in their life, the time of the Ottoman use of the Acropolis and the time of the late 19th century and 20th century use of the sanctuary of Poseidon as a farmstead, are deliberately forgotten with this selective process. But material memories are not that easy to erase. Their durational qualities allow them to intervene in the present, to claim their coexistence side by side with the contemporary conceptions of these fragments as archaeological objects dated to the ancient past. These fragments, as all material things, are multitemporal. The fragment from the Erechtheion, the Athenian Acropolis, was half buried in rubble in recent years, and it was condemned to invisibility and to oblivion. Its present fate is unknown, by the way, and friends tell me that it has vanished from its site. And yet, through its photographing as part of scholarly and other interventions and projects such as the other Acropolis photoblog, it has acquired a new visibility and a new sensorial prominence. The same applies to the block from the sanctuary of Poseidon. And in this case, the fragment and its multitemporal qualities forced us to not only notice it, record it, and draw it, but also make it an essential part of our itinerary in our guided tours. Groups of visitors would gather around it to hear about its various temporal moments and stories, photograph it, and trace with their own hands the engraved letters and numbers on the stone. This artifact continued living not only through these sensorial engagements, but also in a literal, organic sense, through erosion, through decay, and through the lichens which have colonized the grooves, processes that are making the inscribed dates and names increasingly invisible. In a few years' time, this inscription will be decipherable only by the sense of touch, through the hand. Every sensorial perception, I've already said, is full of memories. The senses are multitemporal, they're past and present at the same time, they entail the simultaneous coexistence and communion of perception and memory. Furthermore, if the durational qualities of matter enact and activate multiple times, then such enactments become possible through multisensorial engagements involving materiality and, more broadly, what Merleau-Ponty has called the flesh of the world. Our examples also demonstrate that duration does not mean inertia, continuity, or the stability of matter. Duration is definitely not stability. The default state of durational matter is flux, is change, is differentiation, and it is often our own temporal chauvinism that sees matter, including archaeological artifacts, as static and as permanent. Duration, of course, has its own, often diverse temporal rhythms. In the 5th century BC, our first stone had been transformed from a piece of marble embodying its own geological duration into an archaeological object which actualized, materialized certain mythical pasts. deities, legendary heroes such as Erechtheus, citing at the same time other sacred buildings which stood in the same location. This was a process of selective mnemonic recollection which turned virtuality into actualization. In the 19th century, the Ottomans did not simply find a ready-made panel to carve an inscription praising the ruler. It was the sensorial impact of the piece upon them, the affective properties of marble, as well as the durational qualities and its mnemonic weight as a feat of wise men of another time, of the past, which compelled them to use it for their inscription, enriching thus further its durational and mnemonic history. In doing so, they accentuated the multitemporal qualities of the object. They brought into sharp focus the coexistence of past and present. It was the sensorial and affective qualities of that block, which, with its material, visual, and tactile presence, the ordered and calligraphic nature of the inscription, and the coexistence of various pasts and the presents, which caught my own sensorial attention. In photographing it, in producing, that is, more material and durational things in photographs, we actualize distinctive material memories out of the virtual memories of the Ottoman past of the Acropolis. After all, as Sebald, the literary author, has put it, the spectral presence of photographs, and I quote, releases us from the passage of time. They act like barriers or weirs which stem the flow. It's the end of quotation from Sebald. A few meters away from the stone, we took this photograph. In this case, there is no monument as such, no artifact, only pure geology. The surface of the Acropolis rock, exposed. And in fact, it was the polished surface of the rock and its slippery nature which forced us to notice it. Adjust our movement accordingly, otherwise we would have broken our legs, and turn our camera downwards to photograph it. Now, this tactile visuality of this image recalls mnemonically both the history of cleansing of the site from its post-classical remnants, which left the bare rock exposed, but also the history of 200-year-old pilgrimage on this sacred locale. So it was the steps of the millions of visitors which polished the rock, continually modifying it and reshaping in the process. So the surface of this rock embodies the material memory and history of the site according to our feet, the history of the site according to our feet, and enacts at the same time multitemporality and duration in flux, though, in continuous movement, in continuous change. Our photograph adds another layer and commands sensorial attention, for example, your own sensorial attention now, stemming the flow of time, as Sebald put it. But I know there are many skeptics in this room, so one would object that such directly multitemporal objects are relatively rare, and that we can in fact continue discussing them within the discourse of spolia, or reuse of the past, or even the archaeology of memory, without resorting to obscure French philosophers. And that, despite our philosophical statements on the multitemporality and the duration of matter, we can in fact continue treating the majority of archaeological objects and contexts as monochronic, for the sake of convenience at least. Well, here is another case that goes on to prove, at least has proven to me, that this in fact is not possible, that this act of saying, okay, for the sake of convenience, we will treat the rest as monochronic sites is not possible. And that archaeology is and should be defined as multitemporal. When I was invited by my collaborator and colleague in Greece to co-direct the excavation of this site, I was told by her, by the literature, by others, that this is a Middle Neolithic tell site. It soon became clear, however, that this is not the case. One of the first finds we encountered in our first excavation season was a much later Bronze Age drinking vessel, a kylix. And over the following years, we encountered, side by side with the buildings that were dated to Neolithic, Bronze Age finds, including in this case a small tholos tomb, Mycenaean tholos tomb, late Bronze Age tholos tomb. And even a later medieval inhumation burial of a woman. So this site, this tell site, continued living long after the Neolithic. It had an eventful and rich biography and had accumulated significant mnemonic weight well before our presence and our archaeological engagement with it. As is the case with many sites, that mnemonic weight was recollected and actualized by subsequent people, often seeing on this site an ancestral locale, an appropriate place for them to return their date, their own date, as it happened in the Bronze Age and in medieval times, and who knows, maybe in other times. Again, the skeptics amongst you would object. What's news here? The past in the past is now a recognized domain of archaeological research. Yet such research works within the assumption of succession. In this case, succession of different uses of the site, often within the same locality. It does not thus grasp the concept of time as coexistence and of memory as actualization of various coexisting pasts. But then again, can we say that at least in the Neolithic, which are after all, Neolithic the traces are the more substantial in this site, can we say that this site, at least in the Neolithic, was monochronic, can be seen as monochronic, broadly speaking? Especially since in this case, as we know from our dating, we're talking about a relatively short-lived Neolithic presence on this tell. Now, as many of you know already, tells have been created because of a successive rebuilding on exactly the same spot. You can see this very, very clearly, often respecting the orientations of previous buildings and faces, as is our case. They are thus discussed in Neolithic archaeology as sites of ancestral memory and continuity, but still within the conventional chronometric discourse of linearity and succession. But let's have a more careful look on the material traces of these buildings. For a start, our perception of succession and vertical linearity is a synoptic view of the materials in front of us. It partly derives from our own methodologies of vertical stratigraphic excavations. These buildings had walls with stone foundations, as you see here, and mud breaks for the upper layers, although sometimes we do have stone walls surviving up to a meter or 1 meter and 10 centimeters. The roof would have been supported by wooden poles, and branches and other plant material would have been used to construct the roof, at least partly. And clay was used for parts of that roof as well. So once such a building had collapsed or was deliberately destroyed, and we do have cases of deliberate destruction, people would rebuild it, respecting the orientations of the previous phase, but also, and this is crucial, reusing material such as stones from the collapsed house. In cases where different stones were used, you can see some of these faces, other materials such as the bonding material between the stones came from the collapsed mud break of the previous phase. For example, in this case, you can see the bonding material between the stones here, and although between this phase and these different sorts of raw material stones were used, this bonding material here are actually the result of reusing the collapsed mud breaks of previous phases. This is what our geologists also tell us. There is thus a recycling and the flow of materials across generational time, enacting duration and actualizing different paths within the same temporal plane. At the same time, the combination of the white of the stones in this case, this last phase, and the bright red of the clay in the bonding material would have produced distinctive sensorial effects. In fact, similar to the one produced by the most commonly found pottery on site, which is decorated with white on red or red on white decoration, a very common style for the Middle Neolithic in particular. Now, this color combination, which was partly achieved by the recycling of materials, which embody duration and mnemonic coexistence, would have resulted in distinctive affective consensual atmosphere within which communal bonds would have emerged and been reproduced. Even another category of artifacts, such as our collection of Neolithic figurines, which is perhaps the largest in any Neolithic site in Greece, more than 300 at the moment. Even such a category embodies material memory and multitemporality in many and in diverse ways, by citing shapes and types which originate in the previous phase, in the earlier Neolithic, by enduring before the life cycles of individuals, human individuals, and their first handlers, by circulating across generations as at times they were hoarded in wall foundations. These things, some of them we found in wall foundations. And by also being made and unmade, modified, fragmented, and circulating as fragments across time and space. And several of them have been deliberately broken, and we can find the whole set of fragments to put them together. But clearly, we have intentional fragmentation and circulation of fragments, which is also happening in the Balkan Neolithic in general. But how are we, as excavators in this case, to react to this sense of multitemporality? How do we enact such temporal coexistence? And how do we include our own temporal presence on this site? How do we communicate this understanding of temporality to peers and to diverse publics and communities? Well, for a start, this project is an archaeological ethnography project, providing thus the shared space for multiple encounters involving local communities and diverse scholars from many different backgrounds. The experiential temporalities of the local communities were incorporated within the multiple times of the site, starting with the Neolithic, broadly defined. This was done through various ethnographic practices, but also through a program of theater archaeology. That is, a play was written, a script was written during our field season by an actor archaeologist who was member of our team, and was working with us throughout the season. And he was inspired by our archaeological finds and by our ethnographic work and findings to write that specific play. The play was then staged at the end of the season next to the trenches, next to the still open trenches, with the participation of local communities, a large sector of which participated in fact. The script, the play, invoked diverse times by referencing the Neolithic practices, referencing the medieval burial I mentioned, which that burial actually became a scenic component of the performance. Without the skeleton had been already removed. So the archaeological time of excavation became part of that multitemporal mixture and collage with all these different times. And also the experiential time of our local communities became part of that play, because people could hear in the script and the play references to their own practices, to their own lives in the present, even to their own food recipes. Polyphonic singing and performance, at the end of which food was prepared on site and was consumed communally in the sounds of live music performed by musicians from the local community, was the final act on that performance on that play. So in this case, multitemporality was enacted, in this case literally, in a directly embodied and affective manner with all these processes of affectivity, sensoriality, and incorporation, including in the consumption and eating of food and drink. So, archaeology is conventionally defined as the study of the past on the basis of its material traces. This is what we teach our students, what we read in our textbooks. Recent developments in our own thinking, in our thinking practice, have shown that this definition is no longer adequate. I have argued today that it is the rethinking of the durational properties of matter which can help us radically reshape and redefine the discipline. So, what is archaeology? One of our colleagues, Laurent Olivier, who has done extensive and very interesting work on the links between archaeology and memory, proposes, I quote, "It is the basic mission of the discipline to define itself as an archaeology of the present." End of quotation. While I'm in agreement with many of his ideas, I would fundamentally disagree with that statement. And here I come to the title of my talk. I would also disagree with his division of things between present-day ones lying on the surface, which are accessible and for which, quote again, people can give objective accounts, end of quotation, and those things buried and which, again quotation, cannot be understood through first-hand accounts, end of quotation. Now, here lies the danger of presentism, but also the implicit colonial ontology of absence, or even, if you want, ab/sense. The idea that, with the exception of the present, all material traces from various past cannot be directly linked to living humans. Well, as we saw in the various examples I presented to you today, this is not the case, in fact. As humans engage directly and multisensorially with things of various types, modify them, interpret them, make stories, and sometimes make up stories about them, exhibit them, and rearrange them in various ways, incorporate them into their own affective worlds. So, instead of an archaeology of the present, then, I'm proposing a multitemporal archaeology. Archaeology as the affective and mnemonic recollection of multitemporal fragments. If materialization is a selective process of transforming virtual past into material past through sensorial attention and affectivity, then archaeology participates in this process of attention, affectivity, sensorial recollection. By sensorial recollection, it turns virtual memories into material memories. This is an archaeology which does justice to the past, whereas in linear and successive and chronometric time, the past was seen, as I said, as a dot in a line, and it was caught between two presents. The present that it once was, and the present from which we now observe it. This is an archaeology which explores the multiple ways of temporal understanding in diverse social contexts. An archaeology that does justice to the two fundamental entities at the core of our discipline, that is materiality and temporality. It is not the study of ancient things, but is concerned with all material things, all things in general, which are treated not as past, not as present, but as inherently multitemporal. And it is that multitemporality which makes our operation fascinating. At the same time, it is an archaeology which is interested in the dialectic between materiality and immateriality, in the things that happen in the spaces in between materials, artifacts, humans, other non-human beings, in the sensorial assemblages that are structured and engendered by affectivity. Now, the implications of this reconceptualization of time in archaeology are, I think, considerable. In fact, it entails the recasting of archaeology as a multitemporal, corporeal, and sensorial practice, which inevitably undermines the archaeo in the title of the discipline. Some, most notably Tim Ingold, have suggested that in the same way that anthropology should overcome anthropocentricity by abandoning the anthropos in its title, archaeology should also shed the archaeo. Only that the concept and the name of archaeology carry too many interesting connotations within, and as we know, well beyond the confines of our discipline. And we don't need to think of major theoreticians using archaeology as a metaphor or as an interesting kind of scheme to work things through. I'm proposing thus to retain it in plural, archaeologies, and qualified at the same time, demonstrating the existence of many and diverse multitemporal archaeologies before and alongside modernity and modernist archaeology. Such a new discipline will be attentive to the sensorial lives of things as multitemporal entities. It will be, to quote my friend and colleague Alejandro Aber, an undisciplined discipline. Not only because of the risky and unpredictable nature of the sensorial, but also because of the activation of the political lives of matter. The coexistence of multiple times simultaneously would render problematic the use of archaeology as a refuge, as an escape to a distant, remote, and harmless past. Efforts to ignore politically risky and threatening temporal moments would run into difficulties. Material memories would spring up unexpectedly, disrupting the sensorial homogeneity and producing thus dissensual possibilities, despite the attempts for a complete erasure. After all, processes of erasure and desertification have been going on at the site of the Acropolis, as I mentioned at the beginning, for 2 centuries, and yet that fragment I show you managed to survive and be with us today. My definition of archaeology inevitably brings it closer to a range of disciplines and practices, from philosophy to contemporary art and several other fields in between. Due to its sustained engagement with matter and time, a philosophical archaeology will emerge, contributing thus to our current ontological and even ontogenetic concerns in our lives in general. But even in the broader social and political arena, a multitemporal archaeology can potentially have a serious impact. Frederick Jameson, one of the most interesting and most famous cultural theorists today, in the latest issue of the New Left Review Journal, and in an earlier article in the Critical Inquiry, talks of the end of temporality as the fundamental condition of our neoliberal present. He refers to, and I quote, dissolution of past and future alike, a kind of contemporary imprisonment in the present. This is the other part of the title. He bases this thesis primarily on the working and imagery of the logic of financial capitalism, of course. And his main worry and concern that we are lacking today utopian thinking, thinking about the future. What, in other words, in his book Singular Modernity, called archaeologies of the future, is another use of the term archaeology. I would contend, however, that all contemporary struggles invoke, one way or another, various pasts, at times instrumentally, often within national imaginings, and in many cases in a multitemporal thinking that refuses to accept the linearity of dominant modernist frameworks. These virtual pasts, however, can be actualized in a multitemporal archaeology. A modernist archaeology of linearity would be imprisoned in the past, whereas an archaeology of the present runs the risk of falling for the cultural logic of presentism and of the neoliberal order. An ontology of duration, however, can bring forth all these material presences that activate multiple times. It can engender and encourage a dialogue on a dialogue which is quite urgent today, and more than ever before, on matters of being, on living, on historical trajectories that could have been otherwise, on the perils of temporal progressivism, and on the perils of teleology as a way of thinking, as a mode of thinking. This will be a temporality not of static, inert continuities, but of durational differentiation and change. A temporality that dispenses with the perceived closure of modernity and its false breaks and prophecies. Think of various pronouncements for the end of history. And we'll imagine instead utopias, not in the distant future, but in our own multitemporal here and now. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was a wide-ranging discussion, and not just in a chronological sense, but particularly towards the end when you sort of come to political implications, and then most of all the implications for the discipline itself. It can still be called a thing. But before I go on, I'm sure there are questions by other people, so I would like to open up the floor to questions, comments, please.
Yanni,
Hi.
as I understand it, you're calling for a multitemporal archaeology.
Yes.
And I'm interested in the nitty-gritty of this.
Yeah.
So that would it actually be manifest at the conceptual level of digging itself, reporting, or only at the interpretive stage later on?
Yes. As I tried to show in this example, the example of my own field project, where the next season of which is going to happen this September, I think it needs to happen in all these levels, including at the level of digging, including at the level of presenting what we do to various groups and communities, and of course at the level of interpretation. Now, the nitty-gritty and the specific ways of doing that is still a matter of debate. I mean, this was the theater archaeology idea. It was a project. It was not the first time that archaeologists used theater, but I think in our case it was the first time they actually tried to address our concerns about time and temporality within that process of theater archaeology. So we are experimenting at the moment in finding ways to implement that conceptual framework in the nitty-gritty of day-to-day archaeological thinking practice. I think there is a scope for many more ideas that hopefully collectively ourselves as a community of scholars can actually come up with. Yeah.
So in terms of, the way you've kind of collapsed time and looking at materiality in this sense, how would you incorporate, say, future sensorial engagements into present archaeological practice?
Such as?
Such as, the way that archaeological sites are often will leave part of the site for future archaeological excavations. But I don't think that there's a thought often given to that in terms of how we conceptualize time and our engagement with the archaeological work that we do in the present in terms of excavating the site, and then projecting that into a future sensorial engagement with the parts that we've left. So how might that look, do you think?
Well, most of our thinking today, and many of us who work on some ideas about multitemporality, are primarily to do with links between what we conventionally call past and present. So that notion of future and future is something that we haven't actually explored that much. I think one way, as you said, and implied in your own comment is how you conceive of the life of the site, for example, in the future. What do you actually leave for other people to explore, and how do you actually make these conditions possible for other people to explore that site in a different way? So, as we know, an ethical concern for many of us who do fieldwork is how do we archive, record first of all, and then archive, and then present our own knowledges of the site in such a way as to allow many other people in the future to reconceptualize our site or any site in a different way. So that's one possibility which I think we can think of the future. We can actually incorporate the future into our own work. And we do. We always think, okay, how is this going to be enacted as a durational archaeological archive which can enable different readings and understandings of the same material. And as you know, most archaeologists have actually even implicitly thought of that and are trying to record the site in a way to allow other people to do other things with the same material. So I think that's a very interesting, explicit way of thinking about the future, but I'm sure there are others that I can explore.
Brian really stole my thunder on that one. But in terms of futurity, I want to push a little further on what you said towards the end of your talk about the end of history and how that plays a role. Because this idea of the end of history in terms of the 20th century, it's the idea of industrialization, and it collapses humanity to the sense that there is no sense of futurity.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I mean, it could also stem to it could lead to an idea that there is no past, present, or future at all. So it just collapses time into something that is irrelevant in some way or another. So how does that play into an idea of multitemporality?
Well, as I tried to say at the end, I think the concern, for example, Jameson expressed, which I think is valid in many ways, the concern that, especially in neoliberal capitalism, in a sense, projects this idea of that there's no other future, that this is it, and this is it in a way that involves in many ways the destructive process of remaking the earth and history, can actually be attacked and critiqued on many different fronts. For a start, to show that durational power and properties of matter, to show that despite all these attempts for destruction, for example, for erasure, for closure, for forgetting, for oblivion, material traces still enact the presence and still have the power and the agency to actually engender, for example, human actions today, or even activism and kind of oppositional discourses and practices. So that's one way. And for Jameson and that passage, the other way is to enact and come up with utopias that will actually connect various paths with futures and kind of different potentials in terms of alternative scenario for the future. And I think both are strategies that we can also follow in archaeology.
I have almost more a question of a technical curiosity, but I'm quite intrigued that you chose to stage this performance at night, and you speak about time and the importance of time. Day. It requires artificial lighting, which of course creates a very different sensory experience with the place, and almost creates a boundary between what you can see and you can't. I'm curious why you chose night, and how you feel that affected people's interaction with what you were presenting to them.
It wasn't deliberate. It wasn't a kind of an intellectual agenda behind it. It was a purely practical reason, in terms of, first of all, wanting to have the community with us. And they were busy during the day, so the only way people to do it. But now you come to think of it, of course, it has certain sensorial effects on how we did it and what we did it. It worked extremely well because we were able to do all these other things in terms of music and food and drink and dance and all that would have been, I guess, very different if we do it during the day with fewer people. But yeah, it's a very, very good comment, and I need to think about it in the future, actually. See what are the possibilities for doing it different times of the day.
So this is fascinating. I have a couple of intertextual questions. So one is, can you, so I read Hodder's stuff on entanglement lately, and I'm just curious whether you see him as a fellow traveler or and because I think some of what he's trying to do there speaks to some of this, and but one of the things he flags for me is multitemporal, but then the recognition that different kinds of materiality move through time in different ways. So death hovers over all of this, right? I mean, you give
death
this
has
lovely
a biological death for humans.
Well, especially your old man reflecting on his youth, and so his experience of temporality as opposed to the way he's left his mark. Yeah. And then the second thing is to do with violence, which I know you're always fascinated by. And I'm just thinking about this fragmentary sort of multitemporality, and I'm thinking of it in the context of the book by Wagner, To Know Where He Lies, which traces the DNA investigation of Serbian genocide in Srebrenica. And what she's reflecting on there is the very kind of, in some sense, the mobilization of some of the impulses that we all inhabit, right? The postmodern fragmentation of time by a Serbian authority in order to erase responsibility by creating confusion, moving body parts separately, burial, reburial, and so a lot of what you're talking about here, I hate to find myself on the side of the positivists, but in that book is sort of claiming a kind of moral position for there is something here to be uncovered, and we have to sift through the efforts to kind of mess up with the temporalities to actually discover a chain of causation in the more recent past. So those are the two sort of books I'd like you to think with.
Very, very, interesting.
Friends are for.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Well, on the first one, I think, as I understand it, the way I've read the Entanglement book by Ian Holder, it's a book which is concerned with a different set of questions. Sure. I don't think that the notion of temporality and temporality is central. Maybe there is some discussion, but it's not the central concern of the book. So in that sense, I don't see really neither an opposition to it nor a kind of an allegiance in terms of agreement. There's a different kind of writing which I have discussed a little bit in relation to other issues of sensoriality in my sensitive, but it's not something I would refer to it as a kind of central. Books like In the Dark Abyss of Time by Laurent Olivier is more relevant to what I'm trying to do. As well as the earlier discussion I mentioned briefly, for example, the one by the various articles by Jeff Bailey, although his perspective is much more positivistic than mine, and he talks of time perspectivism as subjective time and objective time, which I think is a very difficult kind of and very unhelpful binarism to create. So that in relation to entanglement. In relation to the second part, which is very, very interesting and very difficult to answer, I think what has been happening in archaeology in the past 20 years, and I think I confess that I've been influenced by the tendency, is to valorize the fragment and expose its kind of creative qualities. The fact that, through the input of ideas of Meredith Strathern, seeing as a piece that can enchain people and create relationships and networks. And in the Balkan context, you have an extensive work by our colleague John Chapman, talking about intentional fragmentation, figurines and other things as enchaining people over long distances. I can see that work in certain contexts, but we went through a phase where fragmentation became the other extreme, became the omnipresent, and so I wouldn't want to make the mistake to make it as. I think in your case, you're talking about valorization, not of fragmentation, not of bits and pieces, but of some sort of coherence that needs to be reintegrated. Is that what you're saying? Some sort of a whole that needs to be recovered.
In that particular context, the sort of fragmentation serves to disperse responsibility and make certain kinds of recovery more difficult.
Yeah.
It's a very instrumental. It's a sort of instrumentalization some of the stuff that we feel.
I would agree with you that it's a certain context where ideas about fragmentation can be problematic both epistemologically as well as ethically and politically. So I wouldn't consider this to be something you can actually transport and implement in the case of the context you're talking about, for example. You need to examine all these other evocations of fragmentation and coherence and boundedness at the same time. Your other point, I think was very interesting, is other conceptions of time, which I think are compatible with what I'm saying here, is, for example, biographical time, experiential time, genealogical time, ancestral time. These things, I think, are and can be compatible with multitemporal understandings because they are not chronometric, they are more embodied, experiential, and affective. Yeah.
I wonder, going away from the heady world of philosophy and to the real world, and, well, not the real world.
But this is the real world, too.
Right, no, it's the real world. But I wonder if you could think about actual events that have surrounded us in the past 20, 25 years that might have encouraged us to the approach that you're presenting here. I'm thinking of the Vammayana Buddhas, for example. Is that something that so strikes the conception of the object and materiality that we begin to go down this road? Or?
And did you yourself see a connection here between that event and
I do, and I'm thinking of, we've had some real iconoclasm, real graphic examples in the toppling of regimes lately. I mean, there's been a lot.
The last few weeks as well, yes.
Condensation of this fixation with materiality in the present political arena, and I wonder if that's impacting the direction of scholarship.
In relation to another kind of celebration of materiality here, I've been very careful to, first of all, expose and talk about and celebrate the power of materiality, but at the same time say towards the end that I'm interested also in the interplay between materiality and immateriality, and also on the spaces in between. What's happening when we have things, humans, other non-human beings, the atmosphere, the weather, all these things happening, and we can actually move the discussion from an object or a person to a field of experience. In the Senses book, I call the sensorial field. And I think that interaction and that kind of space where all these things are happening for me is a very, very important one. So I'm not of the opinion that we should valorize exclusively and celebrate only materiality as a concept. I think there are limits and that there is a moment when we have to move to, as I said, from material or human to the field of experience. In relation to the context that you referred to, either the Bible Buddhists or the recent examples of ISIS destruction of many ancient artifacts, I think in that case there's a complicated history that needs to be explored and disentangled. And I'm thinking that in these cases you have elements of a performance, especially in the more recent kind of events. These were things that they were staged for world media. They were filmed, they were circulated as images and as videos, and many of us downloaded them in our computers and played them time and again, being part of that spectacle in many ways. So there was an issue then for us to think of why are we implicated in this spectacle of circulation of certain imagery. Of course, there was, in many cases, real actions happening on the ground, but it was meant to be broadcast as a spectacle, as a performance for people to consume. Now, I don't know enough about that specific context to be able to understand motivations of these people, and I've heard various scenarios, I've heard various explanations by people who are much closer to that context, but I think something we still don't understand as a phenomenon. I think we do need to understand. And I understand that some of our earlier philosophical and other discussions of iconoclasm can be relevant, but perhaps not not the only way of understanding this phenomena, because we need to straighten into that moment of staging performance for a global Western audience.
Great. If I could just sort of interject, the interesting, since you're mentioning art there, is the use of the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei has what he's been doing with Neolithic pottery, which is sort of, well, exactly, sort of that staging, but that's another thing. Great.
And also doing interesting things. For example, when he was describing Coca-Cola, something like that, on Neolithic pot or imitation Neolithic pot. So again, playing with different times.
Sort of stuff, Please.
Thank you for your epigraphical paper. It was really a pleasure to see
I
so
should
many
relabel myself as an epigraphist.
I think your taxonomy has a problem there.
Go on.
It's a very interesting example of the materiality of utopias. In this current week, in Great Britain, there is a general election taking place. And as I'm sure you all know well, Mr. Miliband, the leader of the Labour Party, has recently inscribed on a large stone the principles of the Labour Party's policies, and he's going to erect this monument in Downing Street if and when they get elected. And of course, if they don't, then the utopia of his future perfect ideal kind of manifestation of what was going to be a past it becomes very interesting. It's a very nice example of it. The presence of utopia and materiality. But
I didn't know this. I should look at that. It's very interesting.
I have a question. But ask you to be a little bit more reflective or self-reflexive. And this is in the sense that is your paper and your current project here. This project here. Because I think there are two papers here, perhaps. This second project seems to me to require a little bit of self-reflection, because I think this project might have been almost unimaginable 30 years ago.
This one here,
and that you yourself are part of the kind of neoliberal functionality of academia.
I should kill myself immediately.
Exactly. This is a provocative question.
Yes.
Because you now have to justify your research to the UK funding bodies and think about impact and audience participation. And I posit that there is a kind of functional turn in archaeological studies, largely because of the wider institutional requirements that require you to demonstrate impact of your research. And that if you were to step back from yourself and to look at the way that archaeological research is being conducted, that as of 5 years ago, the academic community in the UK, as opposed to anywhere else, has suddenly become concerned with precisely the kind of things that you're demonstrating here. That 25, 30 years ago, if you were Colin Renfrew, you probably wouldn't be bothering doing.
I think you'd be drinking and eating and dancing.
Well, there are many things I could say here. For a start.
There's a good reason to be in America.
Yeah, for a start. This project has no chances of being listed as an example of an impact case. Purely and simply because there are no financial figures attached to it. So my colleagues and most people in the UK at the moment, when they say impact, they mean financial impact. Right? In this case, I cannot really demonstrate. We didn't make any money, and I can't show with figures that the community is going to make money as a result of what we are doing there. Maybe they will, but at the moment, there is no direct translation of what we do in financial terms. So it doesn't really qualify as part of an impact agenda. And I'm glad for it. I'm not going to, I never even tried to present to them as a case study for impact. In terms of my own intervention, I think I've been engaging with people and communities in the ecology of Greece since I've started doing ecology. So I don't think you can actually claim that I've done it now because of the pressure by sponsors and others to engage. I think from the moment I started doing an exploration how the past is used in the present in Greece, and the moment I started doing archaeological work on archaeology nationalism, which is in, 1988 perhaps, or even when I was, final year undergraduate, these things were constantly in my mind, so they were not really, a result of me trying to kind of be seen as part of the trend. I know you can do that way, but there are other people here, so we'll have to make things clear. Yeah. The rest, I think, later on.
It's interesting that the definition of impact isn't purely financial; it is experiential.
This is what I've been trying to convince many people about. At the end of the day, when they have to present that document to the ref panel, I think it's the figures that actually count.
Well, they've misunderstood.
Yeah.
I think that's actually a good point to continue the discussion over a glass of wine or something else. But before we do so, can I please join me to thank Yannis